Taylor, what's going on, man?
Hey Dave, thanks so much again for having me back.
No sweat.
So I've just had something else get brought to my attention that I need to correct from the long podcast we did last week. So there was one point where I was talking about George Q. Cannon, and I brought up some history from the early 1900s, and I accused George Buchanan of being a hypocrite because he was publicly teaching that you had to live plural marriage in this life where you couldn't receive exaltation, while at the same time actively persecuting and excommunicating post-Second Manifesto polygamists and then secretly making sure his own sons got sealed to plural wives.
Right.
Um, and so okay, so now if this were true, it'd be one thing, but I want to set the record straight and make sure everyone knows that I was wrong. I misremembered a very crucial detail. So there was a man who did exactly what I said happened, but it was not George
Mm.
Buchanan. His name, the person who did those things, was Francis Marion Lyman, and
Oh, okay.
he was the president of the Quorum of the Twelve from 1903 to 1916. And I didn't write about this in my essays, so I hadn't reviewed the information prior to the podcast, and it was just going off of my memory alone, like when I talked about
Sure.
it there in the moment. And unfortunately, I'd crossed some wires in my head. So, because I mean, I first studied this history about 10 or 11 years ago when I read two books by Drew Briney called Apostles on Trial was the first one, and Silencing Mormon Polygamy was the second one.
Okay.
And so Drew goes through a ton of evidence from that period of church history, and I highly recommend these books to anyone interested in learning more about the subject. So again, I sincerely misremembered the actions of Francis M. Lyman and got him confused with George Q. Cannon. And when I mentioned that on the podcast, it was an honest mistake, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because it's only been 10, 11 years since I'd read that. And can you imagine what I might have thought 20 or 30 or 50 years later if I hadn't had
Right.
friends bring to my attention that I was wrong on that?
Right.
And then I went back and checked the sources, sure enough. So um, in fact, since it's possible that like people could stumble across that episode maybe like next year or some down the road, and might not notice or listen to this correction, would you, Dave, be willing to edit the original podcast to take just those comments out?
Yeah. Yeah. And then just leave the addendums up, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah,
Okay.
because perfect. I don't want to. I'm not trying to memory hole this mistake or anything. Like
Right.
this public correction will be eternal proof of my fallibility. Um, but in the interest of truth, I don't want to leave that. What since I now know that that was false information in the original podcast, I don't want to leave it there because I don't want to misinform anyone or distract from the rest of the message down the road.
Sure enough. Yeah. No, we can do that. We can do
Perfect.
that. We'll be able to correct that so that it's not out there hanging out, and then
Right on.
someone doesn't listen to the addendums. But we'll leave the addendums up to just kind of show that hey, there was a mistake made, and we'll go from there. So
Absolutely.
and I'll make sure that maybe I'll put into those show notes. I'll edit those show notes to say see addendums 1 and 2,
Yep.
and that should clear it up. So
Right on. So
awesome.
I guess just in closing, I apologize one last time for wrongfully accusing George Buchanan of crimes he did not commit. I shouldn't have done it. It was an honest mistake. And since I made that publicly, I really appreciate you giving me the chance to fix that mistake publicly. Um, and you know, I still have some pretty major concerns about George Buchanan, especially in regard to his positions on eugenics, as well as his role in getting the 1890 manifesto signed, which maybe we can discuss in greater depth some other
Sure.
time. But for right now, I'm more than happy to just set the record straight. He is not guilty of the crimes and hypocrisy that Francis M. Lyman did.
Perfect. I like it. All right.
Right on.
Anything else?
No, thank you, sir.
Awesome. Appreciate you.
You too.